That works.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining Paul Sheasley and I, Christene Marie, on today's live conversation. We are diving into just honestly a follow up on a really, really important conversation that was had just before Christmas, why interpersonal relationships matter more than your work, which is a glaring statement. It's kind of like, really, that actually is the truth. And what we discussed with John Westman, executive himself and also a Harvard professor, we discussed why this is true and why it is so incredibly important that we know how to do relationships, why the interpersonal relationships and connection, both with ourselves but also with other people, really sets the foundation and groundwork for success in the workplace thereafter. And that success extends to our families and beyond. So, Paul, I'm so excited for this conversation today. We're really just diving deep into some of the questions that
Mm.
folks asked us that we didn't get a chance to cover. And so, with that, I'd love to just hand it over to you to just give a quick recap from your perspective on, what was some of the rocks that we discussed in the conversation with John, and then I'll
Yeah,
go ahead and lead us off with some questions.
yeah. I think one of the main focus points that we discussed, that I think the summation of our session was really that everything is one to one, referencing relationships within the organization, even complex organizations. And as I work with individuals, and as we talked about in that webinar, I really think that progress happens on a one-to-one interaction. And I thought that that was a core theme that John and I had talked about, and especially in relationship to not just relationships, but we also covered aspects of like the nervous system and how our nervous systems are constantly and obviously always present with us in every decision, every commitment, and every risk, essentially, within a relationship. And so we talked about how nervous system regulation is so important, and really that inner architecture piece of understanding oneself within those specific relationships at work and the work environment. And I know we had also talked a bit about the importance of like dopamine, right? Dopamine hits in response to threat states versus reward states, and motivating individuals within the workspace. So those were the three fascinating topics that I think we encountered over that hour's time. And so obviously here to answer more detailed questions that we didn't have time for, and looking forward to it.
Yes, likewise. Well, one of the questions that was posed to us, they actually wrote in via email ahead of time. So I'm really excited that we have this space dedicated to answer questions like that, and then also ones that came up during the conversation. The first one is, how can leaders really put clear guidelines in place to help employees understand the importance of workplace relationships? If someone is coming in with a predisposition that I'm here to do the work and they don't see the value in interpersonal relationships, how can leaders navigate that?
Yeah. This is an interesting topic that comes out quite a bit with emerging leaders,
Mm,
especially within an organization that may come from more of a co-worker led equality relationship, if you will, and then
mm,
they emerge to a leadership position. And so they're trying to navigate the workplace relationships.
mm,
It comes to mind as I'm currently working with someone in that capacity. And I think that leaders are really most effective when they're able to treat those workplace relationships as serving the work. So
mm,
it's like we're building the relationship that people have that they have towards the work, but then we're also looking at it as a group, right? And so it's not the other way around, so to speak. And so I think clear boundaries, they don't require these rigid rules about closeness. I think what they require is like this consistent reinforcement of really just a few principles around the organization,
mm,
especially when it comes to like decisions, and those involving like whether it's like compensation or promotions or access to opportunity. I think they must be like explainable, right? So transparency is so important, I think, to establish healthy working relationships,
mm,
especially when there's like the power asymmetries that exist, like I just referenced, where we're talking about a manager and a direct report. I think that's where transparency matters the most rather than like punishment or some of those other concepts that actually drive away the connection in the relationship. And
Mm,
that's why I always emphasize disclosure and obviously transparency. And some of the things that John Westman and I had talked about was psychological safety. There's a lot of research on ethical leadership, and we can talk about things like perceived favoritism and trust factors that really uh, can drive close connective working relationships or drive them away. And so that's misconduct doesn't even need to exist. It's really looking at like trust,
mm,
favoritism, for example. These are some things that can heavily influence the working relationship. We mentioned the psychological safety piece. And I think when, there's fairness and there's visibility and there's transparency, and we're prioritizing everybody's roles, right? And there's a clarity and there's a
right.
purpose. I think that ultimately feeds into the working dynamic and the relationship. Um, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. Honestly, it reminds me of, a lot of folks that I'll talk to don't at first blush see the value in actually writing out your values. And I
yeah,
think it's kind of similar with interpersonal guidelines. Like this is how we will conduct our interpersonal relationships. It serves for the positive to say
right.
this is how we want you all to engage in a positive way, but then it also staves off the inappropriate dynamics. And so I'd be curious your thoughts on actual guidelines to like preventative guidelines in addition
Sure.
to informative guidelines, not just romantically, but to your point about once you do start connecting different spheres of executive to junior staff, how do you ensure appropriate boundaries and guidelines are in place?
Yeah. So this is I actually like that question quite a bit because it gets into, at least for me, the kind of the psychology and organizational nerd that I am, uh, having an opportunity to look at behaviors and group dynamics. So, quite the watered down version is that we're really looking at these warning signs, and they tend to be behavioral rather than like moral, right? So, we're looking at these behaviors. And one of the first indicators that I find is information distortion. So, we're looking at these, when we talk about like clicks and stuff, we're looking at like these side conversations or even selective sharing or decisions that appear settled before the broader group has even engaged. So there's like that off balance piece. Another signal is like feedback avoidance. And I'm actually talking to someone now about how do we lead these check in groups without a feeling and appearing like we're in this micromanagement type of
Right.
leadership role. And so, we want to be able to encourage and actually protect the work and the work slash relationship with those that are involved. So, I help leaders understand like what is like these boundary slippages,
Mm,
such as people speaking uh, on like one another's behalf or becoming unusually defensive, and when relationships start to be questions or there's like emotional spillover. So these are some of the context clues that I can help leaders take a look at when it comes to helping to set healthy team relationships and boundaries. And really none of them are like really, the intent isn't I guess malicious when we start to see these slippages. It's really more signals that a relational gravity is beginning to outweigh that like collective clarity. And so that's where I think, especially managers and leadership roles can begin to learn to how to evaluate kind of the temperature of the team by having relationships with them. And I think that's the only way that you'll be able to have constructive feedback or to access feedback in general to then have constructive conversations.
I love that point that effectively the only way to lead well, especially when it comes to these interpersonal relationships guidelines, you have to have the relationship with a person, especially considering
Mhm.
every person is so different.
Yeah.
So, understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong here, understanding the behavioral signals
Mhm.
people are giving off rather than just almost like looking at the black and white. dogma of things. And that's
Yes.
hard, Paul. So I'd actually like to dig into that a little bit. It's easier to operate in black and white than it is to
Mhm.
operate in color, where there's more fluidity, where you're looking at the behavior of the person based on who they are. Because
Yeah.
one person doing one thing behaviorally is very different than another person
Yeah.
based on their temperament. So for leaders looking to cultivate that, obviously, they meeting with an expert, this is what you do. So
Mhm.
obviously that's a way that leaders can evolve. What's another way if they're like, okay, I just want to do some self-growth here? What are
Yeah.
some practical steps that they can take even before meeting with someone like you?
So I think some practical steps they can take is building on the self-awareness and self-reflection.
Mhm.
A lot of leaders have great questions and they talk so fluidly about their concerns, and they're kind of open-ended, kind of stuck points. And I'm like, listen to yourself talk. You're asking some really great questions. So one homework tool, if you will, is I'll have them ask questions or to put on paper the questions or concerns that they have, and then to go back and answer them to the best that they can. So whether that's an issue with colleagues at work or burnout or transition or just any numerical value of challenges that they have, I think just taking some time to reflect, and to truly define for yourself individually, what am I experiencing? What is the source? What is the question slash concern? And having an understanding of like where are we going to put our energy and efforts. So I think that's a very useful kind of basic tool of self-reflection that any person in leadership roles can use.
So good. As you were sharing, it just
Yeah.
reminded me, if we really want to get to know other people, we have to get to know ourselves. So
Yes.
being aware. Start
Yeah. No,
by
and it goes back to being in touch, I think, as well. So if you're in touch with yourself, then you have the capacity to understand how to be in touch with others. As we were talking about setting healthy boundaries within the work, I mentioned the word clicks, right? So it's interesting that I think a lot of organizations have clicks. And I think it's an opportunity to understand like what do those clicks actually mean, within that sphere, because clicks actually form when a series of people feel that they are under pressure. So it's not necessarily like an act of feeling excluded. It's just that people gravitate towards familiarity, especially when demands are high, or they're under pressure, or they're not being heard, or they're disgruntled. And so when we go back to, as you asked those two very important questions earlier on, which is why I want to kind of circle back to that, looking at the group dynamics is so important as a leader. And especially when it comes to like work productivity and motivation and the relationship that people have uh, to work, right? So the leader's role in those cases are not necessarily to dismantle that closeness, but to rebalance. And so we're always seeking balance. And again, bringing it back to the inner architecture, how are you balanced? If you're balanced, you can help others become balanced and ultimately the group to be balanced as well. So this really begins by being able to name patterns without assigning blame, right? And describing what is actually happening rather than who's at fault, right? So we're looking at these kind of structural solutions, I think are often more effective than those specific interpersonal ones, which
Mhm.
also I think can bring about isolation, calling out, which obviously heightens the threat response within groups,
Right.
because we want to come off and we want to activate people's reward system. And we're not rewarding these behaviors. What we're doing is we're saying, you have autonomy, you have a voice, and I want to understand this pressure potentially of what you're going through.
Love it. And actually this leads to my next question. A lot of folks are scanning on a day-to-day basis, whether they realize it or not, just in their subconscious, am I safe here? And do I matter
Mhm.
here? And so while leaders are looking to implement real kind of overarching systems without singling people out, but let's say that they're actually basing this new systems for implementation on real experiences in their
Yeah.
organization. How can they do that while making people feel safe and that they matter?
Yeah, so there's a lot of I think context in that question. Psychological safety is important, right? And so I think day to day, those questions, I think they show up less in what people say and more in how they behave. People don't walk through the door and they go, "I'm not safe," right? So they're not going or it could be, yeah, right. Talk about transparency. Um, it's happening internally, and then externally, that's where they're showing these behaviors. And so, am I safe here appears in whether people speak up in meetings. Usually, it's not that specific. How they like challenge ideas or admit mistakes or even ask for help. And then when you think about do I matter, we're talking about like purpose. Like, do I matter? And if I'm showing up somewhere where I don't matter, I'm not going to feel great, right? Do I feel invited or do I feel excluded? Am I a part of the decisions or am I like feeling like I just have to follow along? So input and acknowledging people's ideas is important. And people ultimately want to feel like their time and effort is respected and even recognized. And so when we think about psychological safety, when people feel safe and valued, they're going to contribute more ideas. They're going to surface problems earlier. They feel like they have an avenue to do that. And there's a ton of research that shows quantified percentages of people who've rated themselves feeling valued and safe and the output. And so you know, I think it's just important that leaders really kind of really emphasize the questions. And I even ask themselves, like, I wonder how my people feel, right? Do
Yeah.
they feel safe? Do they feel involved? And if you answer the question with yes, what's the proof? What are you actually doing that supports that?
Mm,
Or is it just it looks good, it sounds all right, and so therefore the assumption is I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. That's not how it works. It's really answering the question truthfully, like what am I actually doing to emphasize people's feelings of am I safe here?
mhm.
uh, do I matter?
Mm. And so one, I love that you said, is there proof? Because I think otherwise it's all existential. So really putting in, yes, okay, so establishing guidelines like we do with our values,
Yeah,
identifying, okay, what are the warning signs? What are the behaviors of people not feeling safe? And then what's the proof that they are? So what are some,
yeah,
let's start with kind of those warning signs. What are the warning signs? You talked about these earlier. So I just want to circle back and then actually literally create a little list here. You
sure.
some of those you said boundary slippages, and so
Yeah, yeah,
effectively
yeah.
are warning signs maybe that it's not a healthy environment and that people aren't really feeling safe. You said speaking on one another's behalf, which I think
Yeah,
is
yeah,
really, really good. Are they
right.
actually able to use their voice? You
Hmm.
said emotional spillover. What does that mean?
I don't remember how I used that in the context. When did I say that? But anyway, I'll talk more about like that shutting down, things to look for versus getting people, I think, to lean in, which is important. I'm trying to think of how I referenced the emotional spillover, and I'll have to come back to that. But to answer one of your one part question, leaders, like the proof, so to speak, right? So working with a leader who is aware of their interactions with people, right? So they come with their prefrontal cortex intact and they are quashing their own defensiveness in conversations, right? So that would be one type of the proof is there. I was talking to an employee or I was talking to a board member and I felt dysregulated, but I was able to kind of put my prefrontal cortex back online and not become defensive,
Mm,
right? So that purposeful, intentional, um, right? I'm taking responsibility for my communication because too often I'll talk to leaders who are confused about the working dynamics within, their organization with their teams, whether that's in a weekly meeting or one-on-one. And when I would follow up with the direct reports, they would say things like, "I feel dismissed,"
Mm,
or "My concerns are," they're quickly kind of pushed to the side, or the person becomes defensive to my questions, or maybe there's sarcasm even, right? And so when I look at those interactions on a behavioral level, these micro behaviors show that these moments accumulate over time because the mind never forgets. It
mm,
stores that information so that it's actually a protective mechanism so that we can remember the threat. So if over time we continue to be dismissed or feel like we're feeling experiencing shame in these conversations because of the defensiveness, our brain's going to protect us and say, "Don't go to this person for help."
right.
So it's really neat, and it's saturated the information about, team dynamics and leadership. But that's why I like to focus on just these few core principles of leadership to help leaders improve the relatability and how they communicate with people, to
Mm,
bring them in and have them lean in as opposed to leaning out and shutting down,
mm,
because people will shut down when they don't feel safe or they feel like their threats, they have been threatened and activated. So
mm,
for let me give another quick example, and I know I can talk forever. I was, working with a leader who works in a lab, right? And everybody, there was a bench, so meaning that the hood, with we work in the chemicals and stuff, and right, and there was something that had not followed protocol for contamination. And the leader, right, at the time, the person who was responsible for that bench was across the room, and they spoke loudly across the room, addressing the issue with the bench. And later on, that direct report went to another leader and said, "Oh yeah, she's yelling at me. She was yelling at me." And that was the theme. It's like this theme that this person is yelling at people. And really, they weren't. But what happened was this person's threat response was activated. Whether they felt embarrassed, they felt that their autonomy was at threat, they felt like they may have been in trouble or that they were less than, whatever it is, there was some threat event that occurred. So it's nuanced, yes, but it's so important to be then able to come back to that person and go, I heard that something was going on. Let's talk about it, and let's kind of reformulate our relationship and not let that situation fester and be a reminder of what our interactions are going to be like in the future.
yes, yes. What a good point, Paul, because otherwise they do store that. They store that
Hmm.
information, and then it's easy to, God forbid, start talking. Not gossiping
Yes.
is a very hard
Hmm.
habit to curb.
Yeah.
So I'd love to dig into this a little bit because it is really, and we see this. This is the importance of your work, that you're bringing in the psychological piece with coaching and executive performance, because so many people divorce the two and they don't understand how we need to understand how the mind and body work.
Hmm.
Otherwise, you're just only attacking the external and you're not actually getting to internal change. So I'm
Hmm.
so grateful for your work. And so my next question is, people aren't going into leadership positions understanding psychology. They don't even
Hmm.
understand themselves. So we've got two volatile people that have their own memories of things stored in their bodies, that then one little trigger can send them off and then they have no recollection of the real truth that happened. Um,
Hmm.
so I'd love to hear from you in terms of the leader, let's say, where they do have a bigger responsibility than, let's say, Jane, who had that bad memory and bad moment of somebody yelling, and now they're forever predisposed to you or somebody else. So let's say the leader is actually coming in and doing damage control, just creating a fake scenario here. So Jane is triggered. She's been yelled at.
Hmm.
You're the leader going in, and what do you do when Jane is activated?
Well, I think it's, first of all, you have to be ready to enter into that repair, regulated yourself. So if we were to use that leader as an example, if they became offended by the rumor that they're a yeller, right? And then they kind of walk into that person's space and they're dysregulated, the other person is automatically going to become dysregulated and protected. Statistically, right? I love the statistic, by the way. It actually came out by John Gottman, who's studied relationships for
Yeah.
decades, is that if any one person in a conversation becomes defensive within the first 2 minutes of a conversation, the likelihood of that conversation reaching its completion, if you will, is like near zero. It's how derailing defensiveness is, because it causes us to enter into like a threat state, a withdrawal, a resistance. People are going to shut down. And so we really want to approach these complex, I call them complex because the other person is feeling like upset, right? It's complex feelings with, I think, with empathy, with openness, minimizing any perceived threat. They may still feel threatened, they may still feel disrespected or loss of control. And so our job is to understand like what went on for you in that moment. And then to be able to identify like what's the repair. Oh, you felt disrespected and embarrassed. I understand that. I can understand that and relate to it and empathize with it and make the correction and move on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully they're able to move on too. And if they can't, then obviously more intervention may be needed. But
Mm-hmm.
again, it's very specific and kind of case by case, because these things happen in well-intended conversations.
Right.
If feedback feels sudden or it's public or it's ambiguous, um, it's just going to happen. People are going to feel threatened. And I think for any leader, just having a basic understanding of like, all right, if it's going to happen, do I feel effective in helping people to then regain confidence in me and to then focus, not feeling disgruntled about the work, right? And what are some things, kind of some moves that I can utilize in these conversations to kind of rectify this, get this off my plate, get them back to feeling stabilized again, and back to work essentially.
Yes. Yeah, because if you're in threat state, it's gonna, to your point, show up in your work. Um, I really, as you were talking, I just had this thought. I know that you provide a number of services for organizations. I'm wondering if you would ever consider offering effectively like a self-regulation class for employees, because really, yes, it's the leader's responsibility to know how to do that. But if
Yeah,
employees don't know how to self-regulate, we're not taught this in schools.
no,
I
we're not.
no. So I think that would you ever be open to providing that as a service? Because I think that could be one of, man, everyone needs that.
I think it's honestly a two-part. You can't do one without the other. So I think doing for working with leaders and then as well as employees, I think would make more sense than doing one or than the other. Because there's so much like, so if I worked within an organization, I worked with a leadership team, and then I worked with the employee section, and everybody's on the same page,
Right,
I think we're going to have a better outcome, right?
right.
um, even just being able to teach leaders language, right?
Yeah.
Just basic communication things that they can do. Like, for example, one small shift that a manager or leader can take in a conversation is to name the intent before the content.
Mm, I love that.
Simple, right? Absolutely.
Mm,
Because when you name the content, as a receive on the receiving end, I've got to figure out what's your point, what's your purpose here. And if I'm already in a threat state, I'm automatically going to sweep that into the you're
yeah.
coming at me. But if
Wow.
I come in with the intent to say, hey, I want to understand, or I
Yes.
want to repair this, or I want to get your feedback, like you're actually putting their prefrontal cortex back online because now they know what you're there. So saying something like, my goal here is to understand,
Yeah.
not assign blame, or that's going to immediately reduce that threat. And
Mm,
there's just research that backs that up on how to repair trust in difficult conversations when people um, have an understanding of what the conversation is.
that's
And
so
it costs nothing. It's so easy to do that. It's
good.
just practice on it, quite frankly.
Yes. Right. And the practice piece, this is why I so appreciate this, because it is like you go to the gym, you work out your muscles in your body and you grow.
Mhm.
And same thing, same thing with leadership
Yes.
communication skills. It takes practice. So um to that point, I'm just thinking on, there's something around, if leaders were, to your point, the only ones to cultivate this, it's almost like it puts them in a dangerous position, because then they're only ever regulating themselves all the time. But then
Yeah.
that's a big burden for them to carry everyone else's dysregulation coming against them. It's just like, oh my gosh. So for those, like, I'm even thinking, Paul, of the couples, one of them goes to therapy, one of them doesn't. One of them is seeking to grow their own emotional baseline and
Mhm.
regulation, and one of them has no desire to do that. There's only so far that they can go.
Right.
They can only get to be so healthy as a unit, because only one
Mhm.
person is cultivating those skills. So for those who, let's say there are leaders within an organization, I know that there have been many executive leaders who have reached out to you as an
Mhm.
individual rather than on behalf of their organization. So if one leader is coming to you, one person in the relationship is coming and saying, I want to grow, but the other people around them aren't, how can they put in boundaries, recognizing that other people are probably not going to be changing as quickly, or if at all? Like, how can they self protect as they're seeking to grow and regulate themselves?
So, I mean, that's a great point. I mean, I think that just like in a like um couples situation, right? If only one person's coming, and the other person isn't, we'll just say, like, doing the work, eventually I think that over time will continue to erode even more the relationship.
Right.
But ultimately we do have to protect ourselves, and so we will find ourselves in a protective state, especially if those shifts that we're making are not working. So that's why I think it does take a collective of change, especially within organizations. um, when it comes to conflict or just general communication, because you can only, you self-regulate all the time because you're constantly being triggered. At some point, the nervous system's just going to be like, I don't want to do this anymore. I can't take this anymore. And there's either going to be some fight or flight, or maybe even a freeze before they kind of drop out, if you will. So I think it's really important that it's a collective, quite frankly, instead of just an individual endeavor.
Especially because I'm thinking about, if someone is maintaining their regulation while the other person is not, it's almost like emotional battering. You're like, okay, I need to. So, to that point, knowing when we need to get out of the conversation, even for leaders. So,
Mhm.
tell me your thoughts on this. I'm thinking about the higher up is coming in and they're hearing someone's complaint or they're hearing someone's frustration, and they're not getting anywhere. When is the proper time? Because to your point, and I think that this statistic from John Gottman is huge. If you're 2 minutes into the conversation and someone is defensive, you're not going to reach a conclusion. So
Yeah.
what's a realistic way for a leader to handle that? They're they're not getting anywhere. They're starting to feel charged. Do they say, let's talk about this another time? Do they say we need to pause this and come back later? Do they say we need to get a third party? What do they
Yeah.
do?
I mean, all of those are great options. When you're feeling charged, I think it is the responsible thing to just say, we can revisit this
Mhm.
respectfully, obviously, and not leading to, saying the right words so that at least the other person doesn't feel that they're being blown off, right? Because and the other thing too is that, leaders often, as smart as they are, they'll often lead with solutions. It's more
Mhm.
important, I think, to lead with solutions by really linking the solution with the emotion and not necessarily replacing it. So really just having enough room for both. But if you're activated, it's hard to do that. Um, and sometimes a third party is needed because that person becomes the neutral, and they may be able to transcribe either interpretation, reflection, or even sometimes the same thing that the other person's saying just being said by someone else is received because they're not perceived as the threat. So I mean, I think they're all great options. I think again, just the self-awareness is
Yeah.
important. And that's something I would, even teach employees. It's like before you send that email that you can't take back,
Mm,
right? Take time to self-regulate because you can't communicate if you can't self-regulate or if you're dysregulated. And so I mean, I guess you can communicate, but it's not going to be effective. And we want to be effective. We don't always, are we right or are we effective? And some people go, well, I want to be both. I'm like, well, it's better to be effective in addition to making your point. Um, because if you lead with your emotions, especially your threat state, then you're not going to come off very clear, and
mm,
you may actually create another rupture in whatever had transpired prior to that. So now we have two issues, if you will. So it
yeah.
goes both ways, just taking your time, reflecting, writing it down. What is my objective here? How am I going to thread how this actually feels? Maybe it violated a value of mine. So I
Mm,
want to communicate my value. And that clarity I can link to maybe a solution.
that's so good. We have someone watching on YouTube right now. They said all my rejection letters are on automate. I love it. It's just like, oh, you don't even have to take time to write it. It's already, you created it in a non-state of emergency, in a not threat state. I love that. I really love that, Paul. I'm thinking about in the moment, how can folks get regulated for themselves, thinking about the person behind the computer about to send the email, not necessarily the leader, it could be them, but breathing, like just taking a couple deep
Well,
breaths. What else?
I mean, breathing. I mean, we do it anyway. So why why not do it with purpose, right? So just taking a couple of deep breaths. Because when we're anxious, the reality is we don't know, but we often stop breathing. We'll hold our breath, and we'll also shallow breathe. And so we want to breathe. We want more oxygen. We want our brain to feel that it's in less of a threat state. Another thing we can do is we want to get our prefrontal cortex back online.
Mm,
So that's the critical thinking part, right? That's that wise adult piece. And
yeah.
I think what maybe like three simple steps you could do is just name the feeling first,
Mm,
right? So disrespect. Then you understand the story second. What happened?
mm,
What was my absolute truth? What happened here? And then problem solve. Because it matters in that order specifically because that's how the brain processes threat essentially, right? So that emotional acknowledgement is going to reduce that physiological arousal because now we're also thinking and we're naming it. And it allows for perspective taking to take place. If we skip that part, we're we're going to be communicating something we probably wish we didn't communicate in a way that was actually not helpful to us. You
so good.
know, yeah, I mean, conflict resolution techniques, they're not isolated to therapy, right? It's meant for people, right? And so, we talk about research and we talk about conflict resolution and neuroscience, skipping that emotional validation and moving right into solution is going to backfire. I have so many people who can just rattle off just genius things, but then they are so confused when the other person in the end isn't better, it doesn't feel better. They actually feel quite dismissed and they've missed half of what you said. So naming the emotion just doesn't that also doesn't mean you're agreeing with them either. You have your own absolute truth. It just means that you're stabilizing the system, which is the person you're talking to, as a leader, you're taking control of the atmosphere between that person you're talking to. And you're back in the leadership position by acquiring more information, understanding your person, building that relationship, offering a repair, and then getting back to business as usual.
So good. Paul, I'm wondering, if there's anything else, I've got a couple more questions here, but I'm just wondering from your examples and you working with leaders, do you have anything in particular recently that you've been working with anyone in particular on that, man, it's just really changed the way that their organization is running or the way he's showing up or she's showing up?
Yeah. I work with a lot of CEOs, like fractional CEOs and uh, like private equity folks who bring in CEOs to come help reestablish, clean up, whatever word you want to use to reorg or restructure an organization that isn't doing well. And they're coming into patterns of people and work dynamic and production, and they got a lot to catch up on. And there's a lot on their plate, especially those particular CEOs that I work with and leaders. And we often talk about relationships because not only are they stressed, and we talk about their interpersonal stuff, but how are the relationships going in this new organization you just newly acquired that you have 2 to 3 years to turn around? And I love having those logistical, emotional, practical, problem solving conversations that they can continue, that they bring into this new org to really understand, like, what's the story? And that's often a question that I have them lead with is, what's the story? And being able to talk to leadership, and being able to talk to the employees and just accessing people's story. People love telling stories. People have a story. Often people will lead with the negative one. If there's a negative one, if there's a positive one, just great, just is equally important. But I think it's just so important to be able to get the story so that you keep the edge um, around the purpose and facilitating the new relationships of taking over that organization and the people.
Yeah, I love the point about the fractional. I've served as fractional chief marketing officer before, and it's hard coming into a new organization. And to your point, there's such high expectations because you're not there full time. You're coming in with what they believe to be the magic pill, but no one talks about the relational component. So, Paul, that's so good and so incredibly important because if you're not being so intentional with understanding what the story is, man, you're coming in blind. Um,
And the intent is to come in and improve, but interestingly, within people, there's actually a spike
Mm,
of stress, and really a sense of unpredictability.
mm,
So, not only are you coming in where maybe there's an atmosphere that obviously isn't working,
mm,
but yeah, because you're coming in, things are actually feeling worse for the people that are around you because people become hypervigilant. The energy shifts.
mm,
Problem solving might mean losing a job,
mm,
right? And which is the case a lot of the time. And so people are in a threat state, and yeah, unpredictability just ultimately increases the stress response. It's going
mm,
to reduce the initiative, and I think it encourages people to really play it safe. And so, those I think those leaders have a task ahead of them to really find out, like, what's the real story, because what I'm coming into probably isn't the true story. This is just the story of now. What's the story of then?
so good. I've got one more question for you before we wrap up today. Some leaders are very intense. They're very aggressive. They have a lot of energy, and frankly, they like to be fast moving and spontaneous. So, how do they balance that with being super consistent so that their teams feel psychologically safe? How do you do that balance?
Yeah, so intensity, consistency, I think those are important terms because I was working with one CEO, and we talk about intensity, and I'm like, I know you love a challenge, but at this rate of intensity, you're going to burn
Mhm.
out, right? All athletes love the intensity of a game, but you can't play a game every day. You're going to burn out, you're going to get some sort of injury, right? And so some leaders are actually naturally intensive, and they're fast moving. And so when I think about consistency, that's it's like, well, okay, well, I'm a consistent leader, and then it's like, okay, well, what does that mean, right? Like, how are you perceived as predictable? What are your predictable signals? What are you actually doing consistently that is predictable by others around you? And so teams will trust you more when you lead with consistency, even in how you show up. If you show up to the meeting frenzied, stressed, demanding, that is going to elicit the threat response. But if you're consistently calm, then everyone will view you as, they'll be reminded he's a calm person. He's reliable. I can go to this person.
Right.
Um, and so I think that intense leaders can develop safety in their groups by being consistent and how they show up. I think in their values, in the communication of purpose, how they make decisions, and how they emotionally respond to people over time. You can be fast paced, but you have to be consistent. If you're erratic, or you're sucking the energy out, or you're destabilizing, people are not going to respond to that very well.
I'm wondering, how do these leaders get an audit? How do they get to know what other people really think? Do they do a blind assessment where they send out like a leadership assessment for their team? Is that giving the team too much power? Is that actually exactly right?
No, I think leaders will come when there's a lot of warning signs, right? That they're not finding the congruence within their teams, or the productivity, or there's just this consistent misalignment, high complaints, lots of HR stuff, you name it. And so getting that view of the dynamic within the teams is important. There's a lot of assessments that do that, like the 360, for example. Um, I think, the time that it takes to do a 360, for example, assessment, and giving them their feedback, I could have already had a multitude of conversations and acquired that information and much more, and began the planning process with the leaders. And so I think there's often an overemphasis on these 360 assessments. Um, Now, I will sometimes do them, which is why I created my own to capture team dynamics, especially within leaderships and blind spots. But that's not what I'm leading with. What I'm leading with is our relationship and my purpose and my intent before evaluating the content or the context. Um, so I think that, again, having those perspectives is super important, and even helping the leader develop a system of feedback. Like, how am I going to access feedback when I'm gone, right? So I'll often tell leaders, my job is to put myself out of business with you at some point, so that you don't need me, right? So I want to be able to help you integrate your own creative way, but also grounded in how are you evaluating the teams, and continuing to build a team that's in alignment with the value of the company.
So good. So good. Paul, thank you so, so much. How can people work with you if they realize, okay, I'm going to do my homework, become aware, learn how to regulate, take some deep breaths with intention, but I need more help? What do they
Yeah, I mean, you can go to my website, the www.epcleadership.com. There's actually a free assessment on there, and then there's an option to actually receive a deeper dive report, which I obviously give to you one on one, and then you can obviously email me through my web page, and or call for those who like to leave voicemails, and then, yeah, we can carry on from there.
Wonderful. Well, what you're doing again is so important. You know, the integration of psychology with leadership and coaching. That's so rare. So thank you
Yeah,
for your time
thanks.
and for your
Thanks for everybody listening. Yes.
yeah, y'all, thank you so much for joining us. Let me know. Feel free to send Paul or I a direct message if you want the replay of the original conversation with John Westman. The three of us chatted just before Christmas. Amazing conversation. This was the Q&A as a follow-up. So feel free to reach out if you'd like that. And otherwise, Happy New Year, and we will talk
Yes.
with you soon.